Good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening to our friends joining us around the world, from California to Australia. Wherever you are, I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual Radcliffe Day 2020 celebration. Today, of course, is bittersweet. I know we'd all prefer to be together under the tent in Radcliffe Yard, but I'm so glad to be able to convene our community virtually. We're joined today by more than 1,000 registered participants, including many who celebrated a virtual commencement yesterday. And so I want to begin by congratulating the class of 2020. It's also a privilege to have with us Margaret Fullman Mullen, a 1939 graduate of Radcliffe College, who has the honor of representing the earliest Radcliffe class present today. And of course, we're thrilled to be joined by reunion classes from 1940 to 2015, especially the classes of 1995 and 1970, celebrating their 25th and 50th reunions. I'm also pleased to welcome other special guests tuning in from near and far, including Harvard President Larry Bacow, Provost Alan Garber, deans from across the university, along with members of the Harvard Corporation and the Board of Overseers. Welcome to all of you. Of course, the work of the Institute wouldn't be possible without the generosity and the dedication of our advisory council members and donors. I'm very glad to recognize current and former members of the Radcliffe Institute Dean's Advisory Council and the Schlesinger Library Council, as well as former trustees of Radcliffe College and members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society, the Anne Radcliffe Society, and Radcliffe Associates. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your generous support. Last, but certainly not least, today we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Radcliffe Institute's founding, as well as the 60th anniversary of the Bunting Institute, the predecessor of today's Radcliffe Fellowship Program, and the brainchild of former Radcliffe College president, Mary Polly Bunting. We are also marking the 140th anniversary of the founding of Radcliffe College as the so-called Harvard Annex. In light of these overlapping occasions, I'm especially glad to be joined by several former leaders of Radcliffe College and the Radcliffe Institute. First, I'm honored to welcome former Radcliffe College president, Linda Wilson. We have Linda to thank for the beloved Radcliffe Research Partners Program for Harvard undergraduates. Linda also established the Radcliffe Public Policy Institute, among many other achievements. And we're joined by all three of my esteemed predecessors as dean. Liz Cohen, who led the Institute for 7 years and helped to secure its financial future through the successful Radcliffe Institute campaign, Invest in Ideas. Barbara Gross, who invested in the sciences at Radcliffe and launched the program we know today as the Academic Ventures and Engagement Department. And our guest of honor, founding dean of the Institute, as well as Harvard President Emerita, Drew Gilpin Faust. We at the Institute are so proud of our connection to Drew, and I'm especially pleased to be able to be in conversation with her today. Drew is just great. After all, what's not to like? She's a fellow historian, a fellow daughter of the South with lived experience of that region as a crucible of American race relations, and she's a personal inspiration to me and so many other scholars and leaders. Thank you so much, Drew, for being here. And with that, let's dive in.
Thank you, Tomiko. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. So the title for today's conversation draws from a letter that acting Radcliffe Institute Dean Mary Maples Dunn sent to then Harvard President Neil Rudenstine, reporting on the first year after the 1999 merger of Radcliffe and Harvard. Dunn refers to overseeing the merger as a most unusual opportunity. I'd like to start there at the inception of the Institute. I wonder if you can tell us about the impetus for the creation of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard.
Well, Mary Dunn was speaking from her knowledge of of Harvard and of Radcliffe. She'd been serving as the director of the Schlesinger Library. And she had come to see, as Neil Rudenstine had recognized during the term of his presidency, that it was time to devise a new relationship between Radcliffe and Harvard. During the course, basically, of the 1970s, women had been all but fully integrated into the undergraduate life of Harvard College. And so that part of Radcliffe's mission was achieved. And that was something that Elizabeth Cary Agassiz had hoped for at the very beginning when she founded the Harvard Annex. It's something that Mary Bunting very much hoped for. So there was this terrific success with the full participation of women in the college. And Radcliffe College then became a little uncertain about what its mission should be. And this was an impetus for Neil to think about during the last years of his presidency, as he was anticipating stepping down, making things, resolving things in a new way. Radcliffe was a separate corporate entity, and he felt that the two should be joined together in a way that enhanced each one's strength. And so he and Linda Wilson came together and negotiated the new Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study with the help of many others around them, including Harvey Feinberg, Susan Wallach. Just how do you bring about change in the most constructive way? And Mary saw this as a wonderful opportunity, as did I, once I was brought into the dynamics of it, because here was this highly venerable institution, Harvard University, that was going to develop a new dimension. And it was going to have a special focus on women, though not exclusively on women. It had its own venerable tradition of excellence. And here was a chance to shape something new in the middle of something very old and very widely respected. So what wasn't to like?
Exactly. Thank you for that, Drew. And I have to say that I am so fortunate to have Susan Wallach and Nancy Beth Shearer, who also was involved in that period as key advisors now. They serve on the Dean's Advisory Council. And it's wonderful to have people with that institutional memory advising me at this time. So the second thing that I wanted to ask you about is, why did the Institute's founders land on the idea of an Institute for Advanced Study, and why this particular model as opposed to the one at Princeton or in Palo Alto, and what was borrowed from the pre-existing Bunting fellowship experience?
Well, I wasn't there during the merger talks, but my understanding of these decisions is that the success and the reputation of the Bunting was such a critical part of Radcliffe's excellence that seemed like something good to build on that also could be of enormous value to Harvard. Now, the second part of your question was, why this particular sort of Institute for Advanced Study? And what's interesting is actually how unformed much of that was when I became dean, when I was named dean. Neil was very open with me and said, you need to figure out how to make this work and make it good. And of course, you'll be consulting with me and others, but how should we create this fellowship program? And when I was named dean, which was in the spring of the year 2000, I said I wasn't going to come and actually show up until January because I had lingering commitments at the University of Pennsylvania where I was teaching. And I didn't know that this would be an invaluable time for me to really figure out what a future for the Institute might look like before I actually had to execute on it. But those months were a wonderful time to listen to everybody who had been involved at Radcliffe and Harvard in the merger discussions, and also to bring together a group of people that advised me about what an Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard might look like. And this was a committee, we called it the Ad Hoc Committee, that Neil helped me form. And it included the heads of most of the prominent existing institutes for advanced study, the Princeton Institute, the National Humanities Center, the Center for the Study of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, as well as a number of other very prominent academics. Caroline Bynum, historian from Columbia, was the chair. And one of the members of the committee that I'd never met before was a scientist from Princeton named Shirley Tilghman. At that time, she was not yet president, but she was a very distinguished scientist. And so her input was invaluable. And we went back and forth about what the Institute should look like. Should it have sponsored, defined research projects that we would name and bring lots of people together around and focus on a few projects? Could we do science? That was a big question. Could you do science at an Institute for Advanced Study where people had to come and leave their labs and travel from elsewhere? And Shirley was insistent on this, and we soon drafted Barbara Gross to be part of the discussions with this group. But Shirley said, you cannot have something that's meant to highlight women and their importance and their contributions in this day and age and not have an opportunity to do science in it. So the particular shape of the fellowship program and the way it was integrated with the other elements of the Institute, what should be the future of the Public Policy Center and the Murray Center, which had existed for quite some time, all of that began to be formed out of this very distinguished committee. So the current structure of Radcliffe was not a foregone conclusion defined at the time of the merger.
Mm-hmm. That's great to know. And Drew, I want to go back for just a minute to talk about what drew you to Radcliffe. I think you probably answered in part this question. But when you were offered the deanship of Radcliffe, you were a professor of history and director of the Women's Studies program at Penn, and you had been offered other leadership roles, but had turned them down. I would love it for you to talk about what made this opportunity different. What made you think of the Radcliffe deanship as the, quote, most exciting job in higher education, as you once referred to it?
Well, there's one story I love to tell about this whole process, because Neil Rudenstine called me up in the fall of 1999 to say that the Institute had been formed and did I have any advice about how it should be structured. He was calling people all over the United States. And, I'd been around the block a couple of times. I figured he was calling me because I was on some list of potential candidates. I had no interest in an administrative job. I turned them down, as you said before. I had no interest in leaving Penn. But Neil kind of kept at it. He showed up in Philadelphia. He said, I'm just going to happen to be in Philadelphia. Could we meet? That was probably November. Then I didn't hear from him until after the new year. And in January said, actually, I'd sort of like you to be a candidate. And he said, if you have as much as 1% interest in this job. And by that time, he had told me so many fascinating things about the opportunities at the Institute. And I'll say a little more about that. But I said, 1%, sure, 1%. The next thing I knew, I'd accepted the job, and it was March, and he was announcing that I'd be the inaugural dean. So this ploy, this strategy of Neil's is one that I've used quite often on potential deans. And Alan Garber will tell you it is exactly what I did to him when I hoped I could recruit him to come and be provost at Harvard. So thank you, Neil, for that. So what is it that he told me that was so fascinating? It was the opportunity, partly what I said about Mary's enthusiasm, the opportunity to build something new within a structure of tradition and support, a kind of safety net of intellectual excellence and experience. And also I felt that Harvard needed to get women's issues right. And it had been a place with lots of controversy about inequities to women, a place where women faculty did not feel they were thriving. And so I thought, if we could get that right in this leading institution of higher education, it would have such reverberations beyond the Institute. I also loved the emphasis on the intellectual dimensions of the Institute and the chance to make contributions to an intellectual vibrancy at the Institute. And I felt that I would not be being asked, and Neil assured me I would not be being asked to entirely give up my scholarly life. As the head of an Institute for Advanced Study, I would be encouraged to continue my scholarly work. Well, there were moments when I thought that would never happen again, but I at least felt I had the legitimacy to say I ought to be doing that. And finally, I did get the book I was working on finished, but I felt I wasn't going to be giving up something that was hugely important, and I was going to be able to just do wonderful things with this new opportunity.
Wonderful, indeed you did. And let's talk about one of those wonderful things, the Radcliffe Institute's fellowship program, which has become a signature program. I wonder if you can reflect on the early years of the fellowship program.
Well, as I said, there was some question about what should it be like, and should it have more focus on particular research areas or projects? Should the Institute itself sponsor certain kinds of inquiry and say, we're going to investigate X or Y? And so we tried out some combinations of that. And one of the elements was something called clusters, where we tried to bring a group of people together to collaborate around particular problems. We had a group that came to focus on immigration. But overall, the commitment that we moved towards was really to get the very best people in the fields in which they were excelling and have them come together and communicate across disciplinary lines. We also did have a big emphasis on trying to figure out how to do science, and Barbara Gross was the point person for that, and really integral to making the wonderful scientific programs of the Institute operational and functional. And then another part of it was, and this I think turned out to be so important, not just for Radcliffe, but for all of Harvard, the long tradition of the arts in the Bunting program and the original Radcliffe Institute, and the juxtaposition of creative artists with scholars and practitioners. And that was so energizing. And I have always enjoyed watching the way a physicist and a painter would find themselves so intertwined around issues that they could see in common in their work. And I think this was a little unusual. I don't think there's any other, unless this has happened in another institute for advanced study since I've stopped keeping track. I think this is almost unique to the Radcliffe Institute and a wonderful dimension of its identity.
Agreed. Drew, let's go to a subject that many of our audience members are interested in, and that is very important to us today. And that is the question of how gender fit into institute's mission. If you can say a bit about that.
I think there was a lot of discussion around this at the time of the merger before I joined, and the place that the discussions landed by the time I arrived was that the Radcliffe Institute should have, as an important dimension of its inquiry, the exploration of the experience of women, but it should not be uniquely devoted to that. Now, of course, when Radcliffe College became part of Harvard University, it could no longer exclude men from its programs. It could not have a all-female fellowship program. And you're a lawyer, Tomiko, and you understand this better than I, but there's special dispensations for women's colleges that Radcliffe would lose when it merged with Harvard. So that it became inevitable that the fellowship program would include men. But to have this broader scope of inquiry, I've always felt was invaluable, because it meant that there would be a juxtaposition between issues concerning gender and women and the broader issues of society. And it would bring people together who were working explicitly on issues having to do with gender, and people who didn't think they were working on having anything to do with gender. And I felt that we had all these conversion experiences in the course of the fellowship year, where people would see, who had never thought about gender before, would be together with people whose lives were devoted to those questions. And by the end of the fellowship year, everybody understood their work differently. And that seemed to me a marvelous dimension of how this balance was defined. I know you've had to think about the meaning of it all in many ways. I know that Barbara did and Liz did, and I'm sure you are now, again, 20 years later, trying to think about how do you understand that balance. And of course, gender studies has changed dramatically everywhere and within Harvard as well. And so I hope towards the end of our discussion, when you're talking more about the future, you might say something about how you envision that now. But I think at the time, the balance was one that benefited and enrich the work of people both working in gender studies and people who weren't.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly right. I do want to point out that during your time as dean, you also launched the Gender Conference, which was a way of ensuring that gender remained front and center at the Radcliffe Institute. And of course, Radcliffe Day and the Radcliffe Medal awarded to women leaders is also a way that you were able to do that.
And also the marvelous Schlesinger Library is such a marvelous resource and always attracted fellows who would want to come and be using those facilities. And so that was kind of a natural dimension of it too.
Of course, yes, premier archive on U.S. women. Now, Drew, let's talk a bit about how the Institute has grown over the years within the context of your own professional transition. After 6.5 years at Radcliffe, you became the president of Harvard. And from that perch, you've seen the Institute grow and evolve under the leadership of my predecessors, Barbara Gross and Liz Cohen, both of whom made tremendous contributions to the success of Radcliffe. I wonder if you can tell us what you think about what the Institute has become over time.
I think it's so marvelous. I mean, when I come to the programs I came to this spring, the amazing tap dancer and the presence of the arts in Radcliffe, I think has influenced the whole university. The excellence of the fellows, when I go down the list of fellows and I think, oh my gosh, that person is going to be at the Radcliffe Institute and can share her wisdom or his wisdom with the rest of the university for the year of their fellowship. I mean, it just seems to me, I feel very proud of it. I feel proud that I was associated with it. I felt proud as Harvard president that Radcliffe was part of Harvard. I felt proud when I would go to events and there'd be so many people from the community because I felt it helped Radcliffe and Harvard relate to the world around it and translate scholarly ideas to a wider world, which I think is such an important part of what scholars need to think about. And I also felt proud because it seems to me that from the very outset, from the time that the annex was founded to give women access to a Harvard education, Radcliffe had front and center the notion of who belongs, who should be in this institution, who has the right to access to higher education. And I think Radcliffe has continued to ask that question in times when it has a very different meaning from the meaning it had in the 1870s or 80s or 90s, when different groups are being considered as important groups to include and to support. And so having that persistent message from Radcliffe to kind of remind the university of those values and those traditions and that dedication, I think that's so critical as well.
Yes. Drew, continuing on the question of your perspective as president, I wonder if you can talk about any lessons that you might have taken from Radcliffe to the presidency of Harvard as you consider various crises, challenges, and opportunities.
Sure. When it was the 10th anniversary, I was just thinking back with amazement that it's 20 years. How could that have happened so fast? But I was remembering the 10th anniversary of Radcliffe, and there was an event, a big gathering in Agassiz House, and I was asked to give a little talk. And I think I said that, and this would have been the very beginning of years of my presidency. And I kind of riffed on everything that matters in life I learned in kindergarten. Well, I said everything that matters to my presidency, or so many of the things that matter to my presidency, I learned at Radcliffe. And I still believe that the element I was just talking about, the who belongs question, the push towards inclusion, the push towards access, that's a fundamental aspect of Radcliffe and Radcliffe's history. A second is the presence of the arts, which became a key aspect of my presidency at Harvard, the creation of the Arts Task Force and the integration of the arts into both the curricular life and the broader communal life of the university. And then I think of Radcliffe in many ways as an intellectual common space. Now, Liz Cohen was chair of the University Common Spaces Committee that came up with the idea of the chairs in Harvard Yard and the Smith Center. It wasn't the Smith Center, it was Holyoke Center being transformed, but creating physical spaces for people to come together. And I think that my enthusiasm, my launching of that task force, my embrace of its recommendations grew in part out of the magic that I saw happening at Radcliffe when people came physically together and could exchange ideas in ways they wouldn't have thought they might, except that it happened over lunch or it happened because that person was there, or I asked a question and got an answer I didn't expect. So the kind of serendipity of it was critical. I feel so sad saying this right now as we are all separated and trying to keep our intellectual common space, even as our physical common space has been denied to us for a time. So those were important lessons. I think there were other important lessons too, just about the nature of community and transparency at Radcliffe. And of course, I got a mini tutorial in some of the aspects of budget and so forth that were magnified many times with the much larger dimensions of Harvard University. But there were aspects of, I'd say, the mission of Radcliffe that influenced my approach to Harvard very deeply.
That's very wonderful, thoughtful answer. And you mentioned my own views about Radcliffe. I will say that as the fourth dean of the Institute and as a legal historian, I thought it was really important at the beginning of the job to read the Institute's founding document, so the merger agreement, its mission statement, but also to think deeply about the relationship between the history of Radcliffe College and the Radcliffe Institute. And we did that and then undertook a strategic planning process that resulted in a set of priorities that we're calling Radcliffe Engaged. And that plan really leans into Radcliffe College's history of producing brilliant, civically engaged women. It seeks to amplify scholarship, including from the professions like medicine, public health, law, and education, that informs pressing social problems, of which there are a few in this country. And it aspires to engage the broader community more and more and to engage increasing numbers of Harvard students. And having served as dean of Radcliffe and also as president of Harvard, during which time you made an inclusive student body and community-wide belonging priorities, as you were just talking about, I wonder if you might reflect on what an Institute for Advanced Study can offer students, if not degrees.
Well, I welcome what you just said, and I've loved watching the evolution of Radcliffe towards the notion of Radcliffe Engaged. That is deep in the identity of Radcliffe College. And if I just say a word about when I arrived, one of the challenges that I felt we confronted was we needed to show that Radcliffe could be just intellectually unbelievably excellent, and to kind of create an intellectual legitimacy for the Institute. And so I think my emphasis tended to be to try to get that underway and to ride a little bit on the traditions rather than expand them dramatically at that time of engagement. And so I feel that this is such an excellent moment and direction that you're taking the Institute, because no one can doubt the intellectual excellence of the Radcliffe Institute at this point. And we Pulitzer Prize winners here and there, and just extraordinary galaxies named after you or whatever the heck it was last year. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So to go back to that earlier emphasis and say, all right, how do we mobilize all this in pursuit of the mission of engagement is just so admirable. Students, well, the wonderful Radcliffe Research Partners Program has been a part, as you said, of the Institute for many years, with Linda Wilson's early support, even before the Institute as in its current form was founded. There are many ways in which students are involved and should be involved, and I hope will be involved in the future. And I can't wait to watch how you develop all those. One obviously has been by attaching themselves to scholars in a mentorship that is invaluable for many students. I know it's sent many students into careers and vocations that they wanted to try out or learn a little bit more about by associating themselves with a scholar or a practitioner at the Radcliffe Institute. So there are so many dimensions in which this can all expand and develop that I'll have a great time being a witness to it all.
Well, thank you, Drew. And I will say about the research opportunities, that program, that we're really happy that it is continuing through the summer and expanding to research teams. And we think that's really important in this moment when students' plans have been disrupted, when people are apart. The opportunity for students to continue to work with faculty mentors seems to me particularly important at this time. We also offer summer research grants in any discipline and subject for students. Of course, there is research and instruction in the Schlesinger Library. And just to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing here now, we are about to pilot an emerging leaders program that will bring Harvard undergraduates together with local high school students around the curriculum meant to inspire leadership and teach about the skills necessary to be good leaders. We have a law, education, and justice focus area that brought to campus last summer in partnership with the Suffolk County DA's office, system-involved high school students for what was called the Summer of Hope. There are art galleries, as you mentioned, where students are able to see the work of cutting-edge artists and to participate in related programming, all to fully integrate the arts into the educational experience. And so there's just an array of deeply meaningful opportunities, and we look forward to continuing to work on those things in the coming months and years. Now, Drew, I want to go back to a point that I started on, and that is your being an historian. It seems to me that your training and your perspective as an historian have shaped your leadership and your priorities in numerous ways. One area that we might mention is the initiative you took to highlight the legacy of slavery at Harvard, an area, I should say, that Radcliffe continues to lead under President Bacow. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to grapple with the legacy of slavery generally, so including but not limited to Harvard today?
Slavery was such an important force in American life from the time of the settlement of the British colonies, Spanish colonies, up until the Civil War, and then in the legacies of slavery that have followed the Civil War. And for many generations, I think people have wanted to just say this is a Southern thing. It doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the United States. And therefore, New England kind of ignored it and didn't look at its own past and didn't ask questions about the contributions of slavery to American life more generally. But slavery was the economic engine of the entire American economy in the years leading up to the Civil War. And it was also a presence in Massachusetts until the 1780s, and then a presence in terms of its economic connections to New Englanders and residents of Massachusetts and institutions like Harvard well up into the Civil War. So I feel that who we are today as Americans, how can I say this on this day when we're seeing this tragedy in Minneapolis? The legacies of race in the United States vex us still, define us as a nation in ways that we have not grappled with. And a big part of dealing with it in the here and now is acknowledging its presence in our past and its defining force in our national identity. So that has to take place at a national scale, but it also has to take place at a local scale and an institutional scale and an individual scale. So to ask the questions, what did Harvard have to do with slavery? The answer is quite a bit. And how do we understand that there were unfree people in our midst as a community, that they made important contributions to this community, that we did some terrible things as an institution, but we also did some noble things, or members of our community did, and leading abolitionist ventures and so forth. So how do we understand all of that? And so I wanted to figure out ways to underscore the importance of these questions. And one of the first places I turned was to the work that Sven Beckert had done with a seminar that he taught in the history department, where students investigated dimensions of the experience of Harvard with slavery, and they had identified a number of ways in which this had occurred. And one of these was that in Wadsworth House, where actually I now have an office, which was built in the 18th century as a house for the residence of the president, 2 presidents had lived there with unfree laborers, and we knew the names of those individuals. And I thought as a symbolic beginning, we should recognize those individuals by their names. These are not anonymous stolen lives. These are particular individual people whose lives were affected by decisions made by individuals of power in the nation, in the state, and at Harvard. So we had a ceremony where we put up a plaque to commemorate the lives of those 4 individuals. And that was a kind of launch of a larger set of inquiries, which you have now inherited. Towards the end of my presidency, brought together a committee of faculty, and we hired a researcher to spend a year digging through the archives to find mentions of slavery and connections to slavery throughout the Harvard record. And so many of those have been uncovered. And of course, the issue of the large initial donor to the law school and the question of the law school shield is something that, Tomiko, you would have encountered, of course, in your role as a law school professor, a sizable gift that was given by the royal family that was generated from work done by unfree people in the Caribbean sugar industry, which is one of the most brutal dimensions of slavery. And so it reaches out to us from other parts of the world, from our own world, from our very back door. And how do we understand that? And how do we come to grips with it? And what do we do about it? Those are questions that remain unanswered. I began to ask them, but I was very pleased to see that Radcliffe was going to kind of take on the leadership of this inquiry going forward. So I'd love it if you'd say a little more about it and where it's going.
Yes, well, thank you for all of the work that you did with the initial committee. The committee is continuing, and we still have folks like Sven Becker on it, Annette Gordon-Reed, Evelyn Hammonds, people who know so much about and care so much about these questions. What we're going to do is a number of things. We're going to approach this in a very Radcliffe way, as you can imagine. So we hope to have programming, conferences about the related issues. At the same time, we are engaging students. So one of the opportunities for student research this summer is on projects related to Harvard and the legacy of slavery. The committee is divided into subcommittees that will explore questions about how to integrate knowledge of that relationship into the curriculum or to extracurricular activities, a subcommittee about the grounds and buildings that are relevant to Harvard and slavery, and of course, an aspiration of engaging the broader community. It is such an important initiative and work that we undertake, with a sense that it's solemn work, and yet it is something that we really must do and continue to do for all of the reasons that you said. We look forward to, by the way, bringing Nicole Hannah-Jones, the Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist from the New York Times to campus, or not bringing her to campus, I should say, interacting with her virtually. We hope to bring her to campus this fall. So we'll have conversations with people, scholars, others who are at the forefront of these questions.
And I should have mentioned, of course, that as I was thinking about how to launch this inquiry, I turned naturally to Radcliffe and said to Liz Cohen, would you have a conference on this? Because, of course, Radcliffe does an extraordinary job of bringing people together and mounting unforgettable conferences. And so there was the conference on Harvard and slavery that I think was electrifying for the community as it brought to everyone's mind the realities that are involved in this relationship between the institution of slavery and this institution of higher education. Thank you, Radcliffe.
Yes, and we expect to, at some point in the near future, have another conference, host another conference that would continue that conversation. Now, we have a number of audience questions. But before we get to those, I want to circle back to the founding and quote for you from a press release or letter from Neil Rudenstine on the date of the merger, where he talked about the merger as being an historic step for Radcliffe and Harvard. It will bring together the intellectual, human, and financial resources of both institutions in a way that benefits both. This opens a new chapter in a partnership that has been around for more than a century and launches an exciting new venture. I wonder if you, perhaps better placed than anyone to understand the relationship, could reflect on the role of Radcliffe within Harvard, particularly now, an era of such complex challenges and real questions about the role of higher education in our society and the value of academic inquiry.
Well, 20 years on, I feel that Harvard is so lucky to have the Radcliffe Institute in ways that I don't think Neil or I or Mary Dunn or any of us who were there either at the founding or close to it, I'm a little bit post-founding, but came along pretty fast, that we couldn't have imagined. And some of those are just the basic center of excellence that the Radcliffe Institute is, and the way it brings outstanding individuals into the community for a year, but then through these wonderful Radcliffe professorships and other commitments that Radcliffe's made, it's been an engine and a vehicle to bring people into the community for longer periods of time as well, and to help recruit outstanding faculty. It's kind of happened from the very outset, because when I became dean, then I went and convinced Nancy Cott to leave Yale and come run the Schlesinger Library, and Mahzarin Banaji came to be the first Radcliffe professor, and that has only taken on this enormous dynamism. And I think there are many institute publications that show the Radcliffe professors, first at the senior level, now also at the junior level. So it's expanding the dimensions of this larger institution in ways that improve it and also diversify it, and that's critical. It's also a center for interdisciplinary work at a time when that is so critical. One of the aspects of my presidency that I felt was extremely important was something that I came to call, or people came to call, One Harvard, which was having different parts of the university take advantage of each other. When I first arrived at the Radcliffe Institute, I found myself introducing Harvard faculty to one another. People who had similar interests, similar research ideas, who had been at Harvard for lengthy periods of time and never met each other. And that just seemed to me to send a message of need to figure out how to integrate this university better and not have it be a whole bunch of tubs that had nothing to do with one another. And I think Radcliffe has played a very significant role in doing that. And I remember it was pretty early on. I can't remember exactly what year she was a fellow, but Carrie Elkins, Radcliffe Fellow, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book during her time at the Radcliffe Institute, said that when she went back to the history department after her fellowship year, she said she went back to a different Harvard. And what she meant by that was during her time at the Institute, she'd met people from different parts of the university. She had been in a university perch instead of a departmental or school perch, and she just saw the university differently ever afterward. And that stuck in my mind, obviously, since I'm quoting you two all these years later, but it seems to me emblematic of the contribution that Radcliffe has made in making each part of the university bigger than it can be all by itself. Bigger, I mean, intellectually and in terms of its aspirations. I would also add the prominence of the arts at a time when that is characteristic or spread across the university more widely. Your collaborations with the ART, the presence of writers and the relationships with creative writing in the FAS. All of this has, I think, greatly enriched that dimension of Harvard's life and made it far more central than it was 2 decades ago. And then I'd add also something I think I mentioned earlier, which is Radcliffe as a mode of communicating with the broader world and reaching out into wider communities, both to share scholarly ideas, but also increasingly now with your initiatives around Radcliffe Engaged, to bring scholarly insight into social change, improving the world, translating our work as historians or whatever else we might be into having an effect on the communities around us. And then, of course, Radcliffe asking always and vehemently and insistently who belongs and how do we keep thinking about that in the right way. So all of those things seem to me enormously important for Harvard and ones that Radcliffe is absolutely central to.
Wonderful, thank you. I agree with all that you've said, Drew, on that.
I might have omitted things. What did I omit, Tomiko, that strikes you? Any things you'd add to that?
Well, you know what? I want to seg from this question to some audience questions that are representative of some things that people are grappling with around Radcliffe's mission and how it relates to today as a way of speaking about that. So this is a question that we received in many different ways. Many people said that while they don't mean to suggest that the Institute should focus exclusively on women, what does the Institute do to advance women? Many people understand that we are home to the Schlesinger Library, which is, as I've said, the preeminent archive on U.S. women. And yet people want to know more about ways that we focus on questions of gender and women in society. And I mentioned, and I would ask you to join in answering this as well. I mentioned the gender conference. The first one you hosted when you were dean. There's the Radcliffe Medal. And perhaps, Drew, you want to say a bit about the medal and the way in which it celebrates women leaders and inspires others. There are lecture series. You mentioned the Radcliffe Fellowship Program, of course, roughly 2/3 of whom over time have been women. And every class of fellows to date has been majority women scholars. You mentioned the Radcliffe Professorship Program, which is a fantastic program anchored here at Radcliffe that has promoted excellence and diversity in partnership with other Harvard schools. And this program, this professorship program, has resulted in the addition of stellar women scholars and scholars of color to the Harvard faculty. And so this is yet another way in which we are promoting women. I mentioned the pilot program on emerging leaders, where teaching about leadership will include questions about how gender shapes leadership. And so I feel pretty confident saying that Radcliffe within Harvard is leading in terms of women and gender and inclusion more broadly. Do you have other thoughts about that?
Well, I have a thought that's in part a hope that as the Radcliffe Institute emerged as an effective and excellent dimension of the broader Harvard community and a place where women were mostly in charge and women were pursuing work on women, many of them. And it was a different balance in the Radcliffe Institute in the early years of the 21st century than it was in the rest of Harvard. And I think it became a place that had just a different culture around women from much of the rest of the university, and that we were contagious. Now, this is, I I say it's a hope because I was in the middle of it, and it was what I was hoping was happening, that as the Radcliffe Institute was establishing its legitimacy and excellence, that it also modeled a different culture in terms of how women were participating in it. And it is my hope that it has been contagious. And certainly there's a long way to go on women's issues in the Harvard community and in the world at large. But I hope that it is better in part because of what Radcliffe represented within it during those years.
Excellent, excellent. Another question that we received in many different iterations was a question about how we justify celebrating a 20th anniversary of the Radcliffe Institute when it was founded in the 1960s. Why wouldn't you want to own that early history? People say from a different time, but no less groundbreaking. And I believe these kinds of questions are asked in reference in part to the new book that's been published about the Bunting Fellowship program. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that question.
Well, Tomiko, you and I, both good historians that we are, both rushed out to read that book this week. It's called The Equivalents, and it's about a group of women within the fellowship program in the 1960s. And it is a fascinating portrait of a part of Radcliffe's heritage. So I think we should celebrate that institute and we should celebrate the Bunting. But what happened in 1999 was different. And the merger of the two organizations, institutions into one is notable in terms of Harvard's history as well as Radcliffe's history. And the possibilities that grew out of that are ones that have been, I think, transformative for Harvard and also for Radcliffe. And so it is worthy of commemorating that milestone, as well as others, including the very initial founding of the Annex by Elizabeth Cary Agassiz. All our history matters.
Oh, absolutely. So, I would agree. We do claim that history. If you look at the timeline on our website, it stretches all the way back to the Harvard Annex and shows all the steps along the way to the Institute that we know today. And as I mentioned, our strategic plan leans into the history of Radcliffe College and all the brilliant women it produced. It builds on innovations of Radcliffe College presidents, including Polly Bunting, Linda Wilson, as well as on the work of my predecessors as dean. And of course, the fellowship program. We claim more than 1,000 fellows now, and it includes women who were here in 1960 and those who have come since 1999. And so I think that we must embrace that history. At the same time, for all the reasons you said, Drew, it's vital to acknowledge the 1999 merger agreement between Harvard and Radcliffe College as officially establishing the Institute that we know today. And in part, we do that to celebrate those from Neil Rudenstine to Nancy Beth Scher and Susan Wallach, who helped to found the Institute, to rally people around it. You as the founding dean, these are important accomplishments, and it wasn't always easy. And I think it's really vital that we acknowledge all of that history, as you say. And now I think that, Drew, we will transition to the closing of our program. And I will do that by saying thank you once again for being with us this afternoon and for helping us mark the occasions of the 20th anniversary of the Institute in our first ever virtual Radcliffe Day. I thought I would conclude by returning to the critical importance of Radcliffe's approach, especially in times like these. Although this isn't how any of us imagined celebrating the Institute's 20th anniversary, the current crisis does shine a spotlight on the importance of deep inquiry and open exchange of ideas across traditional boundaries. We've seen this fact borne out in the remarkable response that we've had to virtual programming examining COVID and health equity, which will continue through June. As Drew wrote recently in the Washington Post, our treatment of the most vulnerable, people who are disabled, homeless, incarcerated, will test our democratic ideals. Throughout history, in fact, moments of crisis have forced us to reevaluate assumptions, policies, and systems. And as we bear witness to the devastating impacts of COVID-19, we at the Institute have an opportunity and a responsibility to bring together our most innovative thinkers and to pursue a more equitable and sustainable public health and social infrastructure. This crucial work can happen, and it is happening at Radcliffe because the Institute is nimble enough to pursue its mission in new ways and focused enough to advance bold ideas despite the challenges all around us. Here's another example of our responsiveness to the moment. This summer, Harvard faculty and students will work together on a vast range of newly launched research endeavors, some related to public health, others far removed from it. Our students, whose lives, studies, and summer plans have been disrupted over the past few months, will benefit from these new opportunities to stay intellectually engaged and to earn income. Our faculty, in turn, will advance ambitious research projects while benefiting from the brilliance and creativity of Harvard students. This summer, the Institute will also host virtual book talks and discussions with distinguished Radcliffe Fellows, and will work hard to prepare for an engaging and productive fall, regardless of the constraints COVID imposes on our in-person operations. So many of you watching today are among our most loyal supporters, and it is your generosity that allows me to make this promise with such confidence. I, along with everyone at the Institute, am truly grateful for your support. Finally, although it's still a year away, I'm very pleased to announce that Melinda Gates, who had planned to be recognized today as the 2020 Radcliffe Medalist, will join us next spring to receive the 2021 Radcliffe Medal. I hope to see many of you next May when we reconvene in Radcliffe Yard. Until then, I wish all of you a happy and healthy summer.